Picture this. A heavy-set man in his early 60s, sick, exhausted, and barely able to sit on his horse, rides out onto a battlefield where his own army is being slaughtered around him. He is not looking for victory anymore. He is looking for a bullet. He wants to die on that field rather than live through what is coming. But the bullet never finds him. Instead, within hours, he will do something no French monarch has ever done before. He will hand his sword to a foreign king and surrender himself as a prisoner of war. This is the story of Napoleon III, nephew of the most famous conqueror in European history, the man who rebuilt Paris into the city we know today, who ruled France for 18 years as its first president and then its last emperor, and who ended his life not on a throne, not even in his own country, but in a rented house in the English countryside, dying under the knife of a surgeon trying to remove a stone from his bladder. It is a story about how an empire built on a legend collapsed in a single afternoon. About a man who spent his entire life chasing the shadow of his uncle and could never quite become him. And about how the fall of one empire in France would end, almost unbelievably, with the death of the very last hope of the Napoleonic dynasty on a hillside in South Africa, killed not by European artillery, but by Zulu spears, thousands of miles from Paris, in a war that had nothing to do with France at all. It is one of the strangest and most tragic royal collapses in modern history, and almost nobody remembers the details. To understand how Napoleon III ended up where he did, you need to understand the sheer improbability of how he got there in the first place. Because unlike most monarchs, he was not born to rule. He was not even supposed to be in the line of succession. He was born Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte on the 20th of April, 1808, in Paris, the son of Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland, and Hortense de Beauharnais, the stepdaughter of the original Napoleon. His uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte, was at that moment the most powerful man in Europe, master of an empire that stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. But by the time young Louis Napoleon was 7 years old, that empire had collapsed entirely. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, and the entire Bonaparte family was exiled from France. Louis Napoleon grew up in Switzerland and Germany, a prince without a country, raised on stories of his uncle's glory, and increasingly convinced that it was his destiny to restore it. This conviction bordered on obsession, and it led him into two of the most farcical episodes in 19th century European politics. In 1836, at the age of 28, he attempted to seize power in France through a military coup in Strasbourg, believing the garrison would rise up in the name of the Bonaparte legend and march on Paris. It did not. The coup collapsed within hours, and the French government, not quite sure what to do with a man who was both a nuisance and a Bonaparte, simply exiled him to the United States. He didn't stay there long. 4 years later, in 1840, he tried again, landing at Boulogne with a small group of followers, a tame eagle he had trained to perch on his shoulder for dramatic effect, and a plan to rally the local garrison to his cause. This attempt was even more disastrous than the first. The soldiers turned on him. He was arrested, tried for treason, and this time sentenced to life imprisonment in the fortress of Ham in northern France. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. A failed pretender, locked away, forgotten. But Louis Napoleon spent his 6 years in the fortress writing. He produced political pamphlets, most notably one called The Extinction of Pauperism, which argued for social reforms to help the working poor. It was clever positioning. He was building an image of himself not just as a Bonaparte, but as a man who understood and cared about ordinary people, in stark contrast to the aristocratic monarchy currently ruling France. In 1846, he escaped from Ham disguised as a laborer carrying a plank of wood and made his way to England. It sounds almost too theatrical to be true, and yet it happened exactly that way. And then in 1848, history handed him an opportunity that even he could not have scripted better himself. Revolution swept across Europe that year, and in France, the July monarchy of King Louis Philippe collapsed. The Second Republic was declared. And in the chaos and uncertainty that followed, the name Bonaparte still carried enormous weight with the French public, particularly among the rural peasantry, who remembered Napoleon's era as one of order, glory, and national pride. Louis Napoleon returned to France, ran for the presidency of the new republic in December 1848, and won in a landslide, taking more than 70% of the vote against several far more experienced political rivals. A man who had twice tried to overthrow the French government through farcical coups was now, remarkably, its democratically elected head of state. But Louis Napoleon had never actually wanted to be a president operating under a constitution that limited him to a single 4-year term. He wanted to be an emperor, like his uncle before him. And so, on the 2nd of December, 1851, exactly 47 years to the day after his uncle's coronation, he staged a coup against his own government, dissolving the National Assembly, arresting his political opponents, and seizing dictatorial powers. A year later, almost to the day, he formally declared the Second French Empire and took the title Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. The number 3 was itself a piece of political theater. Napoleon II had never actually ruled. He was the original Napoleon's son, who had died in Austrian custody as a young man without ever holding power. But by calling himself the Third, Louis Napoleon was making a statement. He was not founding something new. He was restoring something that had merely been interrupted. And for a while, it genuinely worked. The Second Empire, which lasted from 1852 to 1870, was in many ways a golden age for France, at least on the surface. Napoleon III presided over a period of dramatic industrial and economic growth. Railways expanded across the country, French banking was modernized, and perhaps most famously, he commissioned Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann to completely rebuild the city of Paris. The narrow, medieval, disease-ridden streets of the old city were torn out and replaced with the wide boulevards, uniform limestone facades, and grand public parks that still define Paris today. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Paris tourists photograph today, the Paris of postcards and film, is fundamentally the Paris that Napoleon III built. He also hosted 2 enormous World's Fairs in Paris in 1855 and 1867, showcasing France as a center of industry, art, and modern civilization to the entire world. He was also, it should be said, an authoritarian ruler for much of his reign, censoring the press and governing through a police state that monitored and suppressed dissent. Only in the final years, starting around 1860, did he gradually liberalize the empire, a period historians now call the Liberal Empire. But by then, the deeper problems of his reign and of his own health were already accelerating toward a collision he would not survive politically. Napoleon III's foreign policy ambitions were, like his domestic building projects, grand in scale and often reckless in execution. He involved France in the Crimean War against Russia, which succeeded. He supported Italian unification against Austria, which mostly succeeded, though it left him politically exposed at home for angering French Catholics who supported the Pope's temporal power. And then he made a catastrophic decision that would foreshadow everything to come. In 1861, taking advantage of the United States being consumed by its own civil war, he invaded Mexico and installed an Austrian Archduke, Maximilian, as puppet emperor of Mexico. It was a disaster from the start. Mexican resistance under Benito Juárez never stopped fighting, and once the American Civil War ended, the United States began pressuring France to withdraw under the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon III pulled his troops out in 1866, abandoning Maximilian, who was captured and executed by firing squad the following year. It was a humiliation, a costly, bloody, pointless war that achieved nothing and damaged France's international standing considerably. But nothing would compare to the catastrophe that was coming, because sitting to the east of France, a new power was rising, and it was being assembled with ruthless precision by one of the most brilliant statesmen of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia. Bismarck had a clear vision. He wanted to unify the fragmented German states into a single German empire under Prussian leadership, and he understood, with cold clarity, that the fastest way to forge that unity was through a war against a common enemy. France was the perfect candidate. A war against France would rally the southern German states, who had so far remained independent of Prussia, behind Prussian leadership in a wave of nationalist fervor. Bismarck engineered his opportunity through what became known as the Ems Dispatch. In the summer of 1870, a diplomatic dispute arose over a Spanish succession crisis involving a distant relative of the Prussian king being offered the vacant Spanish throne. France, alarmed at the prospect of being surrounded by Hohenzollern monarchies on two borders, demanded that Prussia formally renounce any future claim. King Wilhelm I of Prussia, meeting with the French ambassador at the spa town of Ems, gave a polite but firm refusal and sent a telegram to Bismarck summarizing the exchange. Bismarck, seeing his opportunity, edited the telegram before releasing it to the press, tightening the language to make the exchange sound far more insulting to both sides than it had actually been. The doctored telegram achieved exactly what Bismarck wanted. It enraged the French public and the French press, who demanded war to defend national honor. On the 19th of July, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Napoleon III, sick, exhausted, and privately doubtful that France was ready for this conflict, nonetheless allowed himself to be pushed into it by public opinion and by his own war ministers, who assured him the French army was more than a match for the Prussians. They were catastrophically wrong. The French army of 1870 was, on paper, respectable, but it was poorly organized, poorly supplied, and led by a confused and divided command structure. The Prussian army, by contrast, was a machine built with obsessive precision, using railways to mobilize troops with a speed and coordination Europe had never seen before, and fielding modern breech-loading artillery that outclassed anything the French could bring to the field. Napoleon III, despite being extremely ill with bladder stones so painful he could barely ride a horse, insisted on personally accompanying his army to the front, believing, in the old Napoleonic tradition, that an emperor's place was with his soldiers. It was a decision that would place him directly in the path of the coming disaster. The war went badly for France almost immediately. French forces suffered defeat after defeat as Prussian armies advanced with terrifying speed. By the end of August 1870, one French army under Marshal Bazaine was trapped and besieged in the fortress city of Metz. Another French army, with Napoleon III himself present, attempted to relieve Bazaine's forces, but was instead outmaneuvered and driven back into the small fortress town of Sedan near the Belgian border. And it was there, at Sedan, that the Second French Empire met its end. On the 1st of September, 1870, Prussian and Allied German artillery surrounded Sedan on higher ground overlooking the town and began a merciless bombardment. The French army of roughly 120,000 men was trapped in a valley with nowhere to retreat. French cavalry launched desperate, almost suicidal charges against the German lines, achieving nothing but slaughter. Napoleon III, sick and in agony, rode out among his troops that day, reportedly hoping he would be killed in the fighting rather than live to see what was coming. He was not killed. By the afternoon, with his army being annihilated and no possibility of breaking out, Napoleon III made the decision that would end his reign. He ordered a white flag raised over the citadel of Sedan. The following morning, on the 2nd of September 1870, Napoleon III rode out to meet the Prussian king Wilhelm I and formally surrendered himself as a prisoner of war, along with his entire remaining army of roughly 104,000 men. It remains one of the largest single capitulations in European military history, and it was an almost incomprehensible humiliation for France. A reigning emperor of the French, nephew of the man who had once conquered most of Europe, had personally surrendered on the battlefield and become a prisoner of a foreign king. There was no precedent for it, and there would be no recovery from it either. When news of the surrender reached Paris 2 days later, the response was immediate and explosive. On the 4th of September 1870, crowds stormed the Palais Bourbon, and the Second Empire was formally abolished. A new government of national defense declared the Third French Republic. Napoleon III, still a prisoner of the Prussians, was no longer emperor of anything. His empire had lasted 18 years, and it had ended not in a palace coup, not in an assassination, but in a field outside a small border town, dissolved by decree while its ruler sat in captivity hundreds of miles away. Back in Paris, his wife, Empress Eugenie, learned of both the military disaster and the collapse of the government at almost the same moment. She refused at first to believe it, reportedly demanding to know why her husband had not died fighting rather than surrendered. But there was no time for recrimination. An angry crowd was already gathering outside the Tuileries Palace, and Eugenie, with the help of her American dentist of all people, a man named Thomas Evans, who happened to be in Paris at the time, fled the palace in disguise and made her way, terrified and in near total secrecy, across France to the coast, where she eventually crossed the English Channel to safety. The Empress of the French had escaped her own capital dressed as an ordinary traveler, slipping out through side doors and back streets, while the crowds outside searched for her. Napoleon III, meanwhile, remained a prisoner of the Prussians for several months, held in relatively comfortable captivity at the Château de Wilhelmshohe near Kassel in Germany. A strange, almost surreal interlude in which a deposed emperor lived under guard in a castle while the war he had started continued to devastate the country he no longer ruled. The war dragged on for several more brutal months. Paris itself was placed under siege by Prussian forces from September 1870 to January 1871, a siege so severe that residents were reduced to eating rats, cats, and eventually the animals from the Paris Zoo to survive. France was ultimately forced to accept a humiliating peace, surrendering the territories of Alsace and most of Lorraine to the newly proclaimed German Empire, which was formally declared, in a final calculated insult to French pride, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles itself on the 18th of January, 1871. Once the war formally ended, Napoleon III was released from German custody, but there was nothing left for him to return to. France was now a republic, his empire abolished, his palaces seized by the new government, and public opinion in France largely blamed him personally for the catastrophe of the war and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Like Bahadur Shah Zafar before him, exiled after his own empire's collapse, Napoleon III found that there was no path home. He traveled to England to join Eugenie, who had already secured a home for the family in exile. They settled at Camden Place, a country house in Chislehurst in the county of Kent, southeast of London. It was a quiet, unremarkable corner of the English countryside, about as far removed from the grandeur of the Tuileries Palace or the rebuilt boulevards of Haussmann's Paris as could be imagined. Napoleon III, once the ruler of one of the great powers of Europe, now lived the life of a comfortable but powerless country gentleman, surrounded by a small circle of loyal followers and exiled supporters who still, almost pathetically, referred to him as His Imperial Majesty and dreamed of an eventual Bonapartist restoration that was never going to come. His health, which had already been deteriorating for years before the war, continued its steady decline. He had suffered from bladder stones for a long time, a painful and dangerous condition that had almost certainly contributed to his catastrophic misjudgments during the final weeks of the war, when a healthier man might have made clearer decisions about troop movements and strategy. In exile, with nothing left to occupy him politically, his condition worsened. By late 1872, it was clear that surgery was necessary. English surgeons, including the renowned Sir Henry Thompson, one of the foremost specialists in bladder stone removal in Europe, began treating him, performing a series of procedures to try to break down and remove the stones without a single, more dangerous, complete operation. The final surgery took place on the 9th of January, 1873. Napoleon III, weakened by years of illness and by the psychological toll of exile and disgrace, went under the surgeon's instruments once more. This time, his body could not withstand it. He died that morning at Camden Place in Chislehurst at the age of 64, with the operation itself widely believed to have hastened, if not directly caused, his death. The nephew of the conqueror of Europe, the man who had rebuilt Paris and declared himself heir to the Napoleonic legend, died not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but on an operating table in the English countryside, a prisoner of his own failing body as much as he had once been a prisoner of the Prussian king. He was given a funeral befitting an emperor, even in exile. Thousands of mourners, French royalists, exiled Bonapartists, and curious English onlookers lined the streets of Chislehurst as his coffin was carried to St. Mary's Church, where he was buried. It was a strange spectacle, an imperial funeral procession moving through a small English town, mourning a man whose empire no longer existed in a country that had never been his own. But the story of the Bonaparte dynasty was not quite finished with Napoleon III's death, because there was still his son, Napoleon Eugene Louis Jean-Joseph Bonaparte, known to history as the Prince Imperial, the only child of Napoleon III and Eugenie, and the last remaining hope of the Bonapartist cause. Born in 1856, he had fled Paris with his mother during the chaos of 1870 and grown up in English exile alongside his parents, educated at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, trained as a soldier, and raised his entire life with the expectation, however faint it may have seemed after Sedan, that he might one day restore the Bonaparte name to power in France. And here, the story takes one of the strangest turns in the entire history of European royal exile. In 1879, eager to prove himself as a soldier and to build the kind of military reputation that might one day support a political restoration, the Prince Imperial persuaded the British authorities to let him accompany British forces to South Africa, where Britain was fighting the Anglo-Zulu War against the Zulu kingdom under King Cetshwayo. He was not given a formal combat command, largely because of diplomatic sensitivities around a French prince fighting in a British colonial war, but he was allowed to accompany a reconnaissance patrol as an observer. On the 1st of June, 1879, that patrol, which included the Prince Imperial along with a small escort of British soldiers, was resting near a stream in Zululand when it was suddenly ambushed by a group of Zulu warriors. In the chaos of the surprise attack, the British escort fled or was killed, and in the confusion, the Prince Imperial's horse bolted before he could fully mount it. He was left alone, on foot, facing the Zulu warriors, and in the fighting that followed, he was struck down and killed, stabbed repeatedly with assegai spears. He was 23 years old. His body, when later recovered, reportedly bore some 18 separate spear wounds. Think about the almost unbearable strangeness of that death. The last direct heir of the Napoleonic dynasty, grandson in spirit if not in blood of the man who had once dominated the entire European continent through overwhelming military force and modern artillery, killed not by cannon fire or rifle bullets in some grand European battle, but by Zulu spears in a minor colonial skirmish on the other side of the world, in a war that had nothing whatsoever to do with France, fighting for an army that was not even his own. It was, in its own dark way, as strange and as final an ending as the unmarked grave the British had tried to dig for Bahadur Shah Zafar in Rangoon. Two empires on opposite ends of the earth, both ending in exile, and both in different ways, ending in erasure far from home. The death of the Prince Imperial effectively ended any realistic hope of a Bonapartist restoration in France. Eugénie, who outlived both her husband and her only son by decades, spent the rest of her extraordinarily long life largely in mourning. She died in 1920 at the age of 94, having split her time between England and the south of France as a widow and a mother who had outlived the entire imperial project she had once helped to build. She commissioned a grand mausoleum, St. Michael's Abbey in Farnborough, Hampshire, where the remains of both her husband and her son were eventually reinterred, and where she herself was buried alongside them when she finally died. It remains, to this day, an oddly moving sight, an imperial crypt built not in Paris, not in any French cathedral, but in the quiet English countryside, the final resting place of the Second French Empire in its entirety, tucked away in a country that was never theirs. France itself, meanwhile, moved on from the Bonapartist experiment entirely. The Third Republic that had been declared in the chaos of September 1870 endured, remarkably, for 70 years, becoming the longest-lasting political system France had known since before the Revolution. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany became one of the great national wounds of French politics, a grievance that simmered for decades and that many historians consider one of the underlying causes of the First World War, when France finally reclaimed the lost territories in 1918, nearly half a century after Sedan. Napoleon III's Paris, the boulevards and parks and grand facades built under Haussmann's direction remain standing, and remain standing today, an accidental monument to a man whose political legacy collapsed so completely that no serious Bonapartist restoration movement has been viable in French politics for well over a century. And there is a kind of quiet irony in how history has ultimately treated him. For decades after his fall, Napoleon III was remembered primarily as a failure, a lesser imitation of his uncle, a vain and reckless ruler who dragged France into a catastrophic war it was not prepared to fight and lost an empire because of it. But modern historians have taken a more balanced view of his reign, recognizing the genuine modernization of French infrastructure, industry, and urban life that occurred under his rule. Achievements that, unlike his military ambitions, were built to last, and that millions of people walk through in Paris every single day without ever thinking of the man who ordered them built. He never got the ending he wanted. He spent his entire life trying to live up to a legend, trying to prove that the Bonaparte name still meant something in a Europe that had moved past the age of a single family's ambition. And in the end, he didn't die a conqueror or even a martyr. He died on an operating table in a rented English house, a sick, defeated man, mourned by a shrinking circle of loyalists who still called him Majesty out of habit more than hope. His son, the last real chance for the dynasty to continue, died alone on a hillside in Africa, killed by warriors fighting a war that was never his to fight. And his wife lived on for decades afterward, tending a memory that the rest of the world had largely stopped paying attention to. But like Bahadur Shah Zafar, exiled to Rangoon and buried beneath a stone that would not even name him emperor, Napoleon III's story endures precisely because of how strange and how sorrowful its ending was. An empire built on the memory of one man's uncle, that rebuilt an entire capital city in stone and light, that collapsed in a single afternoon on a battlefield near the Belgian border, and that ended, finally and completely, with spears on a hillside in Zululand. It is a reminder that even the grandest dynasties, built on the most powerful legends, can end in the strangest and most unexpected of places, far from the thrones and palaces where they began. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.